Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this RedGaming.com video, there has been a ridiculous amount of AMD rumours, leaks and speculation that has popped up over the past 24 or so hours, so we're going to be covering that. We're going to start things out with the Navi GPU, and then we're going to move over to the Ryzen 3000 series. We're going to start things out with Navi because frankly I'm less confident that these rumours are true for A, and B, it's going to be way faster to go through, I believe, than the Ryzen 3000 series. So a YouTuber by the name of Adored.tv has claimed that he has a source which has provided him insight into what the specifications and performance levels will be for the upcoming Navi GPUs. Now there are a couple of things here which raise my eyebrows. To be fair to him, he did say take this with a pinch of salt because it's not, 100% confirmed or anything like that. But once again, I do have a couple of questions in regards to the naming convention for A, and B, the specifications and performance. He claims that there's going to be two distinct GPUs. The first is Navi 12 and the second is Navi 10. Now the website WCCF Tech actually did mention that Navi 10 may be cancelled, but Navi 12 was certainly a thing, although it was never 100% confirmed whether Navi 10 was cancelled or not. It was a little ambiguous. But one of the things that really raises my eyebrow is the naming scheme for these cards. They are the RX 3080 and 3060 and so on. Now it's possible that AMD are being very, very aggressive with their marketing. It's not the first time we've seen this. After all, they did essentially steal the chipset names from Intel. As a slight aside, I actually don't like that. I'm saying this from the perspective of a consumer who is thinking of people who aren't so technically educated, who are just like, I guess like the average person, they're just buying stuff. Because I don't like people getting confused over the products they're buying. I like it to be very clear, and I like AMD, Nvidia, and Intel to have all of the separate naming conventions. And by the way, I could also complain, and I have several times, about the way that Intel, for example, conducts itself on the i7 lineup, and now the i5 lineup and the i7 lineup. Yeah, it's just kind of weird. And I prefer things to be a little clearer in terms of naming scheme. So AMD may decide to rename the Radeon 600 series, which is what we assumed it was going to be called, to the 3000 series. That's certainly a possibility. In terms of the performance, the Navi 10 based 3080 is supposedly about 10 to 15% faster than the Vega 64. That's not new information actually. There has actually been numerous reports that this would be roughly the case because AMD were looking to essentially bring down the price of the mainstream cards so that you would get GTX 1080 class performance. That was the original advertised performance that they were using with one source. It was supposedly GTX 1080 for around 250 to around $300 US. But of course, the Vega 64 and the 1080 essentially are interchangeable in their performance levels. One card does better in one game, one card does better in another game. But if you say 15% better than a Vega 64, it's almost like saying 10-15% better than a GTX 1080, because once again, you can almost assuredly say that Navi is probably going to be better at certain games compared to other games. It really depends on what they're doing with the actual architecture, and some games of course will just simply leverage the architecture better, and obviously driver optimizations will possibly improve things a little more as well. Another thing that does raise my eyebrow is that the 3060 is only equipped with 4 GB of memory, GDDR6. This is, of course, most likely to bring the price point down to just $129 US, which is supposedly going to get you the performance of an RX 580. The issue I have there, though, is 4 GB of memory really going to be enough? In my personal opinion, this is probably going to be just one configuration of 2 configurations. Almost assuredly, we're going to see a 8 GB model, but the pricing there would be really tight. We would see not that much of a difference between like an 8 GB model of GDDR6 compared to, let's say, the 3070. See, even I just did it there. It's very, very confusing to think AMD names and then also be thinking NVIDIA stuff as well. But another concern I have actually comes down to the fact that we already have exact pricing. It's possible that these are targeted prices rather than MSRP prices. Now, the reason I say that is because bill of material prices change consistently. There's a reason that AMD and even Sony with the PlayStation 4, for example, didn't know the price until just a few days prior to the console's launch or the processor's launch, because obviously the cost of actually producing stuff, like just for example, the cost of the metals which go into the cooler, the cost of the memory, the cost of, well, just everything, let's just be totally honest, even the cost of shipping changes at all times. So let's say that they're predicting a launch of something even 2 months into the future or 3 months into the future. The cost could have increased for them by like 10%, or it could be 10% less. And obviously they want to make as much profit as possible, but they also want to sell as many cards as possible. So that is one of the reasons that I'm more skeptical regarding this. But with that said, I do believe that there is a possibility that Navi 12 or what have you could launch around the times frames that we're expecting around Computex 2019. And I fully believe that it is going to be PCIe 4.0. My own source that I was speaking to pretty much confirmed that that is going to be the case. And I frankly believe that they are only going to target the mainstream customers. Don't forget, there was a fascinating article by Forbes and a couple other websites as well picked up on pretty much the same story, but originally it was Forbes that broke it, that Navi was basically created for the PlayStation 5. It would just make sense. And obviously, Sony themselves are probably customizing the GPU as well. And so we'll just have to wait and see on that. Personally, I believe that roughly the performance estimates are going to be the same, because they just kind of make sense to me. I don't think we're going to see AMD launch a card which is suddenly going to beat, let's say, the 2080 Ti or anything like that. So personally, I think the Vega 64 to maybe the RTX 2070 just kind of makes sense. It's whether they can do it at a price point. And as I said yesterday, this also ties into some comments from David Wang, along with Lisa Su, who are, of course, the SVP and the CEO of AMD respectively. In those comments, and I'll link the video in the description of this video. God, there's a lot of linking. So yeah, in his comments and her comments, they said that they are going to be tackling ray tracing with a GPU next year. What's more ambiguous, of course, is what their plans are, but they said that ray tracing is coming to a Radeon product. But if you read between the lines, they are essentially targeting the mainstream for ray tracing, because they believe that ray tracing is not going to move until then. So currently they are really focused on the actual ecosystem of the GPU that is obviously getting the ray tracing enabled, and supposedly they're going to be going for DXR. So if you make some estimates there, you can essentially say, well, that just makes sense, because like, let's, say that the Navi cards at the high end can put out roughly the same level of performance as, let's say, the RTX 2070. This is pretty much what I said in yesterday's video, mind. That should, in theory, be enough for ray tracing, assuming they're not going too crazy, and they can optimize it for, let's say, 1440p using DXR. Don't forget, this also coincides, in case you missed yesterday's video, this does coincide as well with news from NVIDIA that they have improved the performance, well, themselves and DICE have improved the performance of ray tracing by up to 50%, and they're still working to get it higher, mind, for Battlefield 5. So that means that 1440p, 60 FPS is now achievable for them, and they're waiting to get it even higher, and I do believe they will, as once again the SDKs mature, as the game optimization and implementation improves, and the drivers improve, and so on and so on. So that to me is certainly a good possibility with Navi and what NVIDIA will likely have to contend with next year. And now let's move over to Ryzen 3000, because a number of people actually messaged me asking if I had seen this leak, which was publicly available on various locations. It first emerged on Facebook and Reddit, and then quickly ImageGur, and then just everywhere. This leak supposedly details the specifications along with the price point and much more of the Ryzen 3000 series of CPUs. I'm not going to read out all the SKUs because I would be here way too long. So instead, I'm going to focus on a key number of SKUs and then give my opinion. There are a lot of different SKUs here, so I'm certainly not going to read out all of them, but a couple of the more interesting ones for me are the 3600X and the 3600GX. So the GX actually features 20 compute units, which we can probably assume is going to be based upon Navi, assuming this leak is accurate. Base clock is 4.8 GHz and 4.5 GHz for the base and turbo respectively, but the GX version is slightly slower, turboing up to just 4.3 GHz, but we also have non-exotic overclocking, which I'm assuming basically means that they're not utilizing like liquid nitrogen to do that. I would also be curious to see what difference, if any, XFR is making here. Is this like single thread performance? Is this all of the processor threads? And so on and so on. We also have the 3700X, which is a 12-core, 24-thread processor, 4.1 GHz for the base clock, turbo up to 4.65 GHz, can be overclocked to 4.95 GHz, and it's going to cost just $300 if, once again, this is true. And then, finally, we've under the Ryzen line, we've got the Ryzen 9 3800X Black Edition, 16 cores, 32 threads, 4.3 GHz for the base, 4.9 GHz for the turbo, can overclock to just a smidgen under the 5 GHz mark, and is going to cost $500. And then finally, we also have a whole bunch of Threadripper SKUs as well. And this includes, but not limited to, the 3950X, the 3970WX, and the 3990WX Black Edition. And these processors can go over 5 GHz in some cases. And the core count, of course, goes up to 64 cores, 128 threads, which is pretty much the same as what we see in Rome.
There is a user by the name of KH Chia, and he goes by the Twitter handle The Retired Engineer. I'll put a link to his Twitter account in the description of this very video. And he and I were discussing block diagrams and layouts of the Zen 2 processor, and of course the various products that will be based upon it, for example the Ryzen 3000 series of CPUs. He personally believes that we're going to be seeing an 8-core CCX design, and from what leaks have started to emerge recently, particularly the Sandra leak, the more that I'm believing that this is most likely correct. In his estimates, he believes that the CPU die is 74 mm squared and the I/O die is 420 mm squared. Now, if you recall, I actually released a video a couple of days ago where I was speaking to a source who I know works for certain with a company that has very close ties to AMD. I obviously can't give the source's name, but believe me, they were definitely verified. And one of the key things that he told me is AMD were working very, very, very much on reducing memory bottlenecks and latency for the various cores. Now, recently I've been conducting a review of the 2990WX processor along with an X399 motherboard. And as a lot of you might know, there is an inherent issue with the 2990WX, and that is that only 2 processor dies are connected directly to the memory, whereas the other 2 dies are connected to those 2 dies. So in short, if you have all processor cores working on a very memory bandwidth intensive task, you can start to get some latency there, and stuff like video encoding cannot scale so well as perhaps you might expect. And this can actually affect if you're doing a lot of multitasking. For example, if you're trying to encode while also simultaneously trying to do a heavy 3D rendering, that type of thing, it can certainly start to impact performance. And anyway, the Retired Engineer actually released a theory a while ago. This was actually back in the 1st of November of 2018 that the website Tech Power Up picked it up, but he had actually released the information publicly on Twitter in the latter part of October. I believe it was like October the 30th-ish, and maybe the 29th that he released the information. Anyway, in his opinion, AMD could solve memory bottlenecks in its MCM CPUs by disintegrating the actual north bridge of the processor. So in short, what AMD would do here is the actual CPU dies themselves, which typically would have an integrated memory controller, so a north bridge controller, that would be disabled. And this happens to be more similar to the design of the Threadripper WX series of CPUs, which don't have direct memory/PCIe access, and instead they rely on Infinity Fabric. So in short, what would happen is that the dies would instead talk to the system controller over the broader Infinity Fabric interface. And this would also be scalable for AM4 products as well. So if the specifications that we have seen publicly leaked are accurate, in my personal opinion, the retired engineer / KH Cheer's analysis, and almost certainly from what I'm hearing from sources, appears to pretty much all meet in the middle. He believes that it's most likely going to be an 8-core CCX because it gives you a much greater degree of flexibility. So for example, if you want to create a 12-core processor, you can just put two 8-core CCXs in, but you simply disable 2 dies on each CCX, which of course makes sense. If you need to create an 8-core processor, you can just disable 4 cores on each CCX, and so on and so on. And you might remember that in the video that I mentioned a couple of days ago where I was speaking to a source, AMD had told his company that they were targeting DDR4 memory speeds of 3200 megahertz. And AMD / his company believed that that should be adequate based upon the changes that they are making for the rest of the processor to not starve the CPUs of data. Because obviously more processor cores, requires faster memory bandwidth, higher memory bandwidth to keep them fed.
So what are my thoughts on this? Well, according to my source, 12 cores to 16 cores for AM4 are certainly going to be what AMD are targeting. Of course, it's possible that just the last couple of days they have finally decided that they are indeed going to go up to 16 cores, 32 threads. So it is possible that over the last couple of days they have updated that information. The second thing is that the last he heard, they were not sure whether they were going to increase the core count of Threadripper up to 64 cores, 128 threads, simply because they were concerned of gobbling up sales for Epic. But once again, it is possible that they might have decided to do something different there. In case you missed the last video, there were several reasons that AMD, at least the last he heard, and it just makes sense, had yet to decide upon the number of cores for the AM4 platform. The first reason was phases and the build of the motherboards. In other words, the more phases that you have, obviously the better power distribution it is to the CPU. I had gone more in depth into this once again in that video, so you can find it linked in the description of this video if you want to go ahead and check it out. But basically, more phases equals good when you are scaling up processor cores and clock speeds, assuming obviously power consumption remains consistent. So what you need to also factor in is then, as a motherboard vendor, well, gee, I need to then add more phases into my board, which means that it increases the size of the motherboard for A, and for B, it also increases the cost of the motherboard. So AMD had to kind of figure out, well, where's the sweet spot? Like, how many VRMs do we suggest as a minimum to board manufacturers, and how's that going to kind of be a thing if we are going for small form factor designs, which inevitably some people want to build a system which is a small form factor, case and all that stuff. So, there are just a lot of moving parts there. The other question, of course, is memory latency and memory bandwidth. But, as I mentioned earlier with the retired engineer, and this does tie in rather nicely with what my source had told me, along with other leaks and bits and pieces, AMD supposedly were trying to reduce the latency of memory and just increase the efficiency of memory bandwidth across their entire set of SKUs. So if they are doing that, as well as increasing the level 3 cache size, and they could certainly do that by, of course, increasing the number of cores per CCX, it's possible that scaling up to 16 cores, 32 threads might not be a big deal. with decently fast memory. And by decently fast, of course, he mentioned 3200 megahertz is in the specification that he's seen for the motherboard designs and the support for the actual chipset. But of course, various manufacturers are most likely going to enable you to go way faster than that. And we've all seen boards which are capable of 3600 or 4000 megahertz and so on for the Ryzen 2000 series. So inevitably, this is going to be a thing for the Zen 2 architecture as well. And of course, he also told me that, everything was going to support PCIe 4.0, USB 3.2, and so on. Do I think this stuff is genuine? Do I think it's legit? Well, no one knows. That's the thing. I personally believe that we are going to see a similar type of layout in terms of the SKUs available. I just don't know if we're going to go up to the clock speeds that we're seeing here. There were other reports that AMD's early engineering samples were hitting around the 4.5, 4.6 gigahertz if memory serves. But of course, given what we know about the 7nm node, it's possible that AMD could do this. After all, they are as well increasing the TDP, once again, assuming these rumors are accurate. So it's possible that if they scale all of that up, they could certainly do it. My question is, of course, what type of heat output and so on. My personal advice to you, do your research, keep an open mind, think it's a possibility that these leaks are accurate, but also take them with a grain of salt. I'm still not 100% convinced of this leak. I wouldn't be surprised if some of it is fairly true. I'm almost positive we're going to see some Ryzen processors with an integrated GPU, because that rumor has been floating around for some time now. In fact, I believe it was even Starship way back in when was it, 2017 or early 2018? I don't remember when. But there was rumors of a variant of Starship actually would have some type of integrated GPU as well. And AMD, of course, have been forever an advocate of APUs and that type of stuff. So for them to kind of trickle that down and put it into a iGPU into a CPU for the desktop, it just makes an awful lot of sense. And the best way that they could do that, quite honestly, would be to take a GPU and then put it into a disabled die or something like that of a particular processor. So all of that makes sense to me. It's just going to be curious on exactly how all of this pans out. Frankly speaking, I'm just going to be very curious to see how Intel responds. But once again, it really does come down to clock speeds. It comes down to clock speeds, it comes down to pricing, and it comes down to things such as power consumption, heat output, and so many other things besides that. I mean, heck, there could be a bug in the chipset for the X570 when it launches, which is just, really crippling. But I don't think that's going to be the case. So I think AMD are onto a winner. But as usual, we'll wait and see. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff, like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.